On a quiet Sunday morning in late autumn, the parking lot of Grace Fellowship Church filled slowly as families arrived for the weekly service. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and coffee drifting from the fellowship hall. Inside, volunteers moved through the building preparing for another routine day. Among them was Daniel Mercer. Daniel was the kind of man people instinctively trusted. He arrived early every Sunday, long before most of the congregation. By 7 a.m. he was already unlocking side doors, setting out chairs for the youth group, and helping the elderly members carry boxes into the building. To many, Daniel represented what the church community valued most: reliability, humility, and kindness. He rarely spoke about himself, but when he did, the stories sounded ordinary. He worked a quiet office job, lived alone in a small rental house a few miles away, and had moved to town several years earlier after caring for his sick mother. People admired his dedication. Parents trusted him to help with community events. The church staff trusted him with building keys. When something needed to be done, organizing charity drives, setting up equipment, staying late to clean, Daniel was the first to volunteer. No one thought twice about it. But trust, once given freely, can sometimes hide the things people never expect to see. For years, Daniel's life seemed steady and predictable. Every Wednesday evening he attended Bible study. On Saturdays he helped prepare food packages for families in need. During the holidays he coordinated toy drives and food collections. He kept careful lists, spreadsheets, schedules, volunteer rosters. It made him appear organized and dependable. Behind the scenes, though, Daniel kept another set of records, ones no one at the church knew existed. Late at night, long after the church lights were off and the town had gone quiet, Daniel sat alone in his house with his laptop glowing in the darkness. The files he opened weren't church schedules. They were something else entirely. Names, addresses, personal details about members of the congregation. Most people would have assumed the information was harmless, just contact details used for church communication. But Daniel's records went far beyond that. He tracked routines, work schedules, when certain people were home, when they weren't. It was the kind of information that only someone deeply embedded in a community could quietly gather without attracting attention. And Daniel had spent years doing exactly that. Yet no one in the congregation suspected anything was wrong. In fact, Daniel had recently been given even more responsibility. The church leadership trusted him enough to ask him to help oversee logistics for several upcoming events. That meant greater access to buildings, storage rooms, and sensitive information about the church's members. To Daniel it was an opportunity. To everyone else, it simply looked like another example of his dedication. Then one evening something small happened. Something that didn't seem important at first. A volunteer named Rachel stayed late after a charity meeting to retrieve something she had left in one of the classrooms. As she walked down the quiet hallway, she noticed light coming from a room that should have been empty. Inside, Daniel sat at a table with his laptop open. At first, Rachel thought nothing of it. Volunteers often stayed late working on projects. But when Daniel saw her standing in the doorway, his reaction was immediate. He closed the laptop. Too quickly. The sudden movement caught Rachel off guard. Daniel smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just finishing up some paperwork," he said casually. Rachel nodded and apologized for interrupting before continuing down the hall. It should have ended there. But something about the moment lingered in her mind. Not fear. Not suspicion. Just a quiet sense that something had been off. Over the next few days, Rachel found herself thinking about it more often than she expected. Daniel had always seemed calm and composed. Yet that night he looked startled, almost nervous. Still, she dismissed the thought. After all, Daniel Mercer was one of the most trusted volunteers in the church. The idea that anything about him could be wrong seemed almost impossible. But sometimes the smallest moments are the first cracks in a carefully built facade. And in the weeks ahead, those cracks would widen. Because the truth about Daniel Mercer wasn't just surprising. It was something far darker than anyone in the congregation could have imagined. And by the time people began to realize it, the secret he had been hiding for years was already beginning to unravel. For most people at Grace Fellowship Church, the weeks following that late-night encounter passed without incident. Services continued. Volunteers rotated through their responsibilities. Families gathered for weekly worship and community dinners. On the surface, everything seemed exactly the same. But for Rachel Alvarez, something about that moment in the hallway refused to fade from memory. It wasn't that Daniel Mercer had done anything obviously wrong. It was the way he reacted. The sudden closing of the laptop. The forced smile. The nervous shift in his voice. The more she replayed the moment in her mind, the stranger it seemed. Still, Rachel told herself she was probably overthinking it. Daniel had volunteered at the church for years. Everyone trusted him. And yet the uneasiness remained. One Thursday evening, Rachel arrived early for a planning meeting for the church's winter charity drive. Several volunteers had gathered in the fellowship hall, sorting through donation forms and supply lists. Daniel sat at the end of the table, typing quietly on his laptop. Rachel watched him for a moment. He looked exactly as he always did, calm, polite, focused. When their eyes met, he offered a brief smile. "Hey Rachel," he said. "Ready for another long meeting?" She nodded and sat down across from him. As the meeting began, Daniel took charge of reviewing logistics. He walked the group through a detailed schedule for distributing food packages to families in need. Everything was organized down to the smallest detail. Addresses, pickup times, volunteer assignments. Several people complimented him on how thorough the plan was. Rachel noticed something odd. Some of the information Daniel had gathered seemed unusually specific, far beyond what was needed just to deliver supplies. He had notes about when certain families were typically home, which houses had side entrances, which homes had dogs in the yard. At first glance, the details looked like helpful logistical planning. But the longer Rachel studied the spreadsheet, the more uncomfortable she felt. Why would a food distribution schedule need information about back entrances? Or when someone usually left for work? She told herself there was probably a simple explanation. Daniel had always been extremely organized. Still, the questions lingered. Later that evening, after the meeting ended and most volunteers had left, Rachel stayed behind to help clean up the tables. Daniel remained as well, gathering papers into neat stacks. For a few minutes they worked in silence. Then Rachel spoke. "Hey Daniel," she said casually, trying to keep her tone light. "Those spreadsheets you made, they're pretty detailed." Daniel glanced up briefly. "Oh," he said. "Yeah. I mean the schedule is great. I just noticed you had a lot of extra notes about people's houses." Daniel paused for a moment. Only a second. But Rachel noticed it. Then he shrugged. "Just trying to make things easier for the volunteers," he said. "Some of those houses can be hard to find, especially at night." Rachel nodded slowly. The explanation sounded reasonable. But something about his response felt rehearsed. As they finished cleaning up, Daniel packed his laptop into his bag. "Anyway," he said, smiling again, "I appreciate you noticing the effort." Rachel forced a polite smile in return. "Of course." But as Daniel walked out of the building, Rachel remained standing in the quiet fellowship hall, staring at the empty chair where he had been sitting. The uneasy feeling returned. Over the next several days, small things began to stand out more clearly. Daniel often stayed late at the church after everyone else left. Sometimes the lights in one of the classrooms remained on long after the building should have been empty. Once, Rachel saw him leaving a storage room that contained old membership records and archived paperwork. When he noticed her in the hallway, he seemed surprised again. Just like before. None of it was proof of anything. But the pattern was beginning to form. One night, while reviewing volunteer contact lists for the charity drive, Rachel opened a shared church database that Daniel had recently updated. The document contained the usual information: phone numbers, email addresses, mailing details. But as she scrolled through the file, something caught her attention. Several entries had additional notes attached. Notes that didn't appear in the official member directory. Things like, leaves for work around 7:30 a.m. Back door often unlocked during day. Garage camera inactive. Rachel's heart began to beat faster. Those notes didn't belong in a church volunteer file. They weren't logistical details. They were observations. Personal ones. And suddenly, Rachel realized something that made her stomach tighten with unease. Daniel Mercer had access to nearly every member record in the church. Addresses, schedules, family information. If someone wanted to quietly collect personal data about dozens of people without raising suspicion, a church volunteer would be the perfect position to do it. Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. Maybe it was still nothing. Maybe Daniel had simply gone too far trying to organize volunteer logistics. But another possibility had begun to take shape in her mind. One that was far more troubling. For the first time, Rachel wondered whether Daniel Mercer's dedication to the church might be hiding something else entirely. And if that possibility was true, then the man everyone trusted most in the congregation might also be the person they understood the least. What Rachel didn't know yet was that the information Daniel had been collecting was only the beginning, because somewhere inside those carefully organized files was the first piece of evidence that Daniel Mercer's secret life had already begun to spiral into something far more dangerous. And soon someone else would notice it too. Rachel barely slept that night. The notes she had seen in the church database replayed in her mind over and over again. At first, she tried to convince herself there had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe Daniel simply collected too much information while planning volunteer routes. Maybe he had copied details from somewhere else without thinking. But the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. Those notes weren't the kind of information someone casually gathered. They required observation. Time. Attention. Someone had been watching. By morning, Rachel made a decision she never imagined she would have to make. She needed to talk to someone. Later that afternoon, she met Pastor Michael Carter in his office. The small room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, the walls lined with framed photographs of church events from years past. Rachel hesitated before speaking. "I'm not trying to accuse anyone," she said carefully. "But there's something about Daniel that doesn't feel right." Pastor Carter looked surprised. "Daniel Mercer?" he asked. "He's been one of our most reliable volunteers." Rachel nodded. "I know. That's why I wasn't sure if I should even say anything." She explained what she had seen. The unusual notes in the database, the strange details about people's routines, the late nights at the church. As she spoke, Pastor Carter's expression slowly changed from confusion to concern. "Are you sure those notes were written by Daniel?" he asked. "They're in the files he updated last week," Rachel replied. The pastor leaned back in his chair, thinking. Daniel had indeed been given administrative access to the church's member database several months earlier. It had seemed like a practical decision at the time. Daniel was organized, dependable, and already helped coordinate many volunteer programs. No one had imagined that access could be misused. "I'll take a look," Pastor Carter said finally. He opened the database on his office computer and navigated through the records. Within minutes, he saw exactly what Rachel had described. Dozens of entries contained personal observations that had nothing to do with church administration. Notes about work schedules, security cameras, household routines. The pastor felt a chill run through him. This was not normal. Not even close. "Have you told anyone else?" he asked quietly. Rachel shook her head. "No." The pastor closed the computer. "For now," he said, "let's keep it that way." That evening, after most of the church staff had left, Pastor Carter contacted a friend who worked in local law enforcement. He didn't make a formal accusation. Instead, he simply asked for advice. What he described raised immediate concern. A volunteer collecting detailed personal information about dozens of families, information unrelated to church work, was unusual enough to justify further examination. Within days, investigators quietly began looking into Daniel Mercer. At first, what they found seemed ordinary. Daniel had no major criminal record. He worked as a data entry clerk at a small insurance company. His neighbors described him as quiet and polite. But the deeper investigators looked, the more questions began to appear. Daniel had moved several times over the past decade. Each move followed a similar pattern. He joined a local church or community organization. He volunteered. He gained trust. And then within a few years he moved again. There was never a clear reason for the relocations. But the pattern was difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, investigators also began examining Daniel's online activity. What they discovered was far more troubling. Using a search warrant, they obtained access to Daniel's home internet records and digital storage accounts. Inside those files were hundreds of documents, spreadsheets, photographs, maps, each one carefully labeled. Many of them contained detailed profiles of individuals from Grace Fellowship Church. Not just names and addresses, schedules, daily routines, security observations, even photographs taken from a distance. Some showed church members leaving their homes. Others appeared to be taken from parked cars nearby. Investigators realized something disturbing. Daniel Mercer hadn't just been gathering information. He had been studying people, watching them, tracking their movements for months, possibly years. The discovery immediately escalated the investigation. Detectives now faced a troubling question. Why would someone collect this level of personal surveillance data on dozens of ordinary families? There were several possibilities. None of them were good. A few days later, police obtained a warrant to search Daniel's home. The small rental house sat at the end of a quiet street. From the outside, nothing about it looked unusual. But inside, investigators found something that confirmed their worst suspicions. One room had been converted into a makeshift workspace. Multiple computer monitors covered the desk. Stacks of printed documents lined the walls. Maps of the town had been marked with small colored symbols. And in the center of it all was a master spreadsheet. A list of church members. Next to each name were detailed notes about routines, security systems, and home layouts. Some entries had additional labels. Low activity. No alarm. Weekend travel. The investigators stared at the screen in silence. This wasn't random information. It was planning. Careful, methodical planning. For what purpose they still didn't fully know. But one thing had become clear. Daniel Mercer wasn't just a quiet church volunteer with unusual habits. He had been secretly studying the lives of dozens of people who trusted him completely. And whatever he was preparing to do next, the investigation had uncovered it just in time. Because hidden among the files was one final document that changed everything. A list. Not of observations, but of targets. The discovery of the list changed everything. Detectives stood silently in Daniel Mercer's makeshift office, staring at the document glowing on the computer screen. Unlike the spreadsheets they had already examined, this one was different. It wasn't a record of observations. It was organized in stages. Next to several names were dates. Next to others were brief notes. Family away weekends. No security system. Side entrance accessible. The meaning was impossible to ignore. Investigators quickly realized they were looking at something far more serious than unusual record-keeping. The document suggested deliberate planning. Planning that could place multiple families in danger. Within hours, the investigation shifted into urgent action. Detectives contacted church leadership and quietly began notifying the individuals whose names appeared on the list. Officers also increased patrols around several homes connected to the investigation. But there was another immediate concern. Daniel Mercer himself. If he realized authorities were investigating him, he could disappear, or worse, attempt to act on whatever plan he had been preparing. Police decided to move quickly. The following evening, as Daniel returned home from work, two unmarked vehicles pulled quietly to the curb outside his house. Daniel stepped out of his car carrying a small backpack. As he walked toward his front door, detectives approached him from both sides of the driveway. "Daniel Mercer?" one of them called. Daniel turned. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face. Then he saw the badges. Witnesses later described how his expression changed almost instantly, not with panic but with a strange calmness, as if he had expected the moment might eventually come. The detectives explained that they needed to speak with him regarding an ongoing investigation. Daniel didn't resist. Inside the house, investigators began asking questions. At first, Daniel answered politely but cautiously. He claimed the files found in his home were simply part of a personal research project about community safety and crime prevention. But the explanation quickly began to fall apart. When detectives showed him the surveillance photographs, Daniel struggled to explain why he had taken pictures of church members leaving their homes. When they asked about the maps and security notes, he hesitated longer each time before answering. Finally, they opened the document labeled Priority List. The room fell quiet. "Can you explain this?" one detective asked. Daniel stared at the screen. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair. According to investigators, his voice remained surprisingly steady when he spoke. He admitted that he had been studying members of the church for years. At first, he said, it had started as curiosity. He liked understanding people's routines, knowing how communities functioned. But over time the fascination had grown. He began documenting more details, tracking movements, observing patterns. Eventually, he started imagining scenarios, ways someone could enter homes unnoticed, avoid security systems, and move through neighborhoods without attracting attention. Detectives pressed him further. "Were you planning to break into these homes?" one asked. Daniel paused. Then he nodded slowly. He explained that he believed the church community represented an easy target. People trusted him. They shared personal information freely. Many never considered that someone within their own circle might misuse that trust. To Daniel, the entire process had become a kind of intellectual exercise. A puzzle. He studied security weaknesses the way someone else might study chess strategies. But investigators weren't interested in the theory. What mattered was the reality. Daniel Mercer had spent years quietly collecting information that could have allowed him to target dozens of families who trusted him completely. Fortunately, the investigation had uncovered the plan before any crime was carried out. Daniel was arrested that night on charges related to unlawful surveillance, stalking, and possession of materials used to plan criminal activity. Authorities also continued reviewing digital evidence to determine whether additional charges were appropriate. News of the arrest spread quickly through the Grace Fellowship congregation. For many members, the shock was overwhelming. Daniel had been someone they greeted every Sunday. Someone who helped organize charity drives. Someone they trusted with their homes, their schedules, and their families. The realization that he had been secretly studying their lives for years left many feeling deeply unsettled. Pastor Carter later described the experience as one of the most difficult moments in the church's history. Trust had been broken in a way no one had imagined possible. Yet there was also relief. Investigators believed the plan had been interrupted before Daniel acted on it. The careful records he kept, the same ones meant to prepare him for future crimes, ultimately became the evidence that stopped him. In the months that followed, the case served as a sobering reminder to the community. Sometimes the greatest risks don't come from strangers. They come from the people who quietly earn trust over time. The ones who appear dependable. The ones who seem helpful. The ones no one thinks to question. Daniel Mercer had built that trust carefully. For years, he had hidden behind the role of a dedicated church volunteer. But in the end, the very records he created to plan his secret life became the proof that exposed it. And because someone paid attention to a small, uneasy moment in a quiet hallway, the secret didn't remain hidden forever.